Hello, anatomy and physiology students. Today, Monday, April 20th, and Tuesday, April 21st, we are going to be talking about the components of blood. So, just a little bit of review from last class. We were looking at the exchange of gases between the respiratory system and then the rest of the tissues. And then you investigate a little bit about hemoglobin and how hemoglobin um, allows for that transfer of gases, specifically oxygen and carbon dioxide, in the blood. So today we're going to look at the different components of blood as well as some um, different terminology that is used to describe the different components of blood. So your job today is to, one, just watch this video of me going through the slides. Just a reminder, you guys can pause at any time to take your notes. So we're going to take notes on these slides. Then I have a Quizlet for you guys to practice some terminology. And then lastly, you're going to go on to Google Classroom and look for the Google Forms quiz about components of blood and take a little quiz on that. And that's a wrap for today. So, review from last class. Last class, we looked at hemoglobin. And just a reminder that hemoglobin is the protein that is found on red blood cells. And that protein, what it does, it's got this specific shape that allows it to bind oxygen. So oxygen will bind to the hemoglobin, and then therefore the oxygen is delivered to the tissue. Remember from that pressure gradient. So if there's a high pressure gradient of oxygen or high concentration of oxygen on the red blood cells, and there's a low pressure gradient of oxygen in the tissues, again, why would there be a low oxygen gradient in the tissues? Because your tissues are using up that oxygen during cellular respiration to make ATP. So specifically like a muscle cell, it's going to be requiring a bunch of ATP to work. Therefore, it's going to be utilizing that oxygen in the electron transport chain. So your tissues are going to need oxygen. Therefore, the oxygen will move from the high pressure gradient to the low pressure gradient of the tissues. At that point, again, the waste product of cellular respiration is carbon dioxide. We know we get carbon dioxide from the Krebs cycle. Haha, you guys thought we were done with cellular respiration? Not quite. But so we're going to get carbon dioxide from the Krebs cycle, and that carbon dioxide will actually come onto the hemoglobin, and then it will be brought back to your lungs to breathe out. So that's what the hemoglobin is, that part of the red blood cell that allows for that gas exchange. Now, obviously, this is involving movement of blood throughout the body, and this is carried out by the circulatory system, also called the cardiovascular system. And so the blood moves throughout the circulatory system, which the main part of that is the heart, in order to pump that blood to allow for movement. And we're going to be talking about that in the next few weeks. But today we're going to look at specifically the composition of blood and what blood is made up of. So, blood. Its function is to transport everything that needs to be carried from one place to another in the body. So it's in this closed circulatory system where it transports nutrients. So we know that review from the digestive system, we get all those monomers of the lipids, of the carbohydrates, of the proteins, the amino acids get absorbed in that small intestine into the submucosa where those blood vessels are, if we remember that. So the nutrients are going to be transported from the blood, waste, hormones from the endocrine system, and body heats. And when we're talking about nutrients, we're talking about anything the body needs. So in this case, we're talking about gases as well. So oxygen is a nutrient, waste would be carbon dioxide. So blood is actually considered a type of tissue. It's a connective tissue, again, because it connects other systems throughout the body and will allow for transport of things. So that's going to be a connective tissue, but it's the only liquid tissue found in the body. And there are two components, or two different types of components of this blood. There are the formed elements, and those formed elements are living cells or parts of living cells. And then there's the plasma. So you guys have probably heard about plasma before, like you can donate your plasma. And that's going to be the non-living fluid part of the blood. So again, we're going to look at the formed elements today as well as the plasma. So here, what we see here, sorry guys if you don't like seeing needles, but again, this is a cartoon image. So when you draw blood, what you do is they put it in a tube, and in order to separate out the different cells of the blood, they put it into this machine called a centrifuge. So the centrifuge is this little spinning machine where it will put these vials of blood or any substance in there, and it's going to spin around really, really quickly. And what that does is it's going to separate the different components based on their density. So at the bottom here, you see that there is going to be the erythrocytes, or the red blood cells, and these are going to be the heaviest parts. So this is going to be very dense because it's at the bottom. Then there's going to be the white layer, which is the buffy coat, which is actually part of the formed elements still they're living, and they're leukocytes and platelets. So leukocytes are actually white blood cells, and platelets, which we'll talk a little bit about later on. And then up top here is that non-form element part, but instead the liquid non-living part, which is the plasma. So the plasma is the straw yellow-like fluid layer that is found at top. And that's going to be about 55% of the blood. All right, so first, let's look at some scientific names here. So the red blood cells, you'll hear me refer to them as red blood cells, RBCs, or erythrocytes. So erythrocytes are the scientific names, and they are about 45% of total blood volume. And that is known as the hematocrit, that solid part of the blood. Then you've got this buffy coat. So the buffy coat is going to be that thin, light white layer again. And that is going to contain the leukocytes. So the leukocytes are the scientific name for the white blood cells. And then the platelets. Now, platelets are going to be little fragments of cells that are actually going to be used for clotting. So they're going to be mixed with those white blood cells. They have the same density. But together, those form less than 1% of the total blood volume. Then we have the plasma again, which is going to rise to the top, which is 55% of the blood. So let's look at plasma. What is this plasma? When we look at the fluid part of blood, we know that there has to be a lot dissolved in there. So again, it's the fluid non-living component of blood. But it's really, really important because it's going to be dissolving many things that need to be transported in the blood. So a few things that it dissolves are nutrients, salts, like electrolytes, sodium, calcium, the stuff you think of when you drink Gatorade, right? Those are electrolytes. Respiratory gases. So there's going to be a little bit of oxygen and carbon dioxide dissolved in the plasma. Most of it's on the red blood cells, but some of them are dissolved into the plasma as well. Hormones, plasma proteins, and we're going to talk about those in a little bit, as well as waste products. So for those things to get where they need to go, they need to be dissolved into this fluid, the plasma. And therefore, that's why plasma is so valuable. So that's why you can donate plasma. A lot of times, living things need to be in this, like living cells need to be within plasma. So it's used for a lot of research, and people actually can, if they're, say, dehydrated, maybe have low blood count, instead of getting a whole blood transfusion, they can actually just get transfused with plasma, which is why plasma donations are very important, as well as blood donations. So plasma, a little bit of a deeper look at it. It's actually made of 90% water. So again, that's where that fluid part comes in. But then we've got some different proteins that are floating around in the plasma as well. The first one is albumin. And this, what it does is it contributes to osmotic pressure. So if you remember from your other science classes, osmosis is the diffusion of water across a membrane. So when you're thinking about it, okay, if we got plasma, which is this 90% water fluid matrix in the blood cells, and it's going to be in the blood, or in the blood vessels, which are these membranes, we want to be able to keep most of that water inside the blood instead of diffusing out to the other tissues that might have less water. Therefore, we have this albumin, which is going to allow that water to stay within the blood vessels. So, therefore, it's going to keep these proteins, keep this osmotic pressure so that the water doesn't flow out of the blood vessels and decrease the volume of the blood. Then we also have transport globulins. So what those do is I said those electrolytes and hormones and lipids all travel within the plasma. These globulins kind of take a hold of those substances and allow them to be transported in the plasma. So globulins are globular shaped and they transport things, so therefore they have the name transport globulins. Then we've got clotting proteins. Now, when we think of blood clots, these can be good and bad, which we're going to be talking about in the next couple of class, but really, when you cut yourself accidentally, you want to be able to stop the bleeding, okay? Your body does. So therefore, we're going to need proteins that allow that broken blood vessel to clot. And that's what fibrinogen does. That's a specific clotting protein that's found in plasma, and that's going to form the basis of the blood clot. So that's found within the plasma. And we're going to learn about this process called hemostasis, which is the formation of a blood clot later on, and it's going to begin with fibrinogen, which is, again, part of the plasma. Lastly, you guys have heard about antibodies, I'm sure, especially in relation to COVID-19. But antibodies are going to be little proteins that are found within the plasma as well that are going to help protect our body from pathogens, from viruses, from bacteria, and they're part of the immune response. And those are going to be floating around in the plasma as well. So that's your plasma information. And now let's go on to the formed elements. So again, the formed elements are going to be the living cells that are found within the blood. And there's 3 different components of the formed elements. There's the erythrocytes, or again, those that are called the red blood cells, the leukocytes, otherwise known as the white blood cells, and then the platelets, which are the cell fragments. So here we can see a microscope slide of these different elements here. And the red blood cells are going to be these tannish, circular looking ones. Those are going to be the majority, again, 45% of blood, but the majority of the formed elements are going to be the red blood cells. And then we see these purple stained guys here. Those are going to be, and you see the different names of them, those are the leukocytes, but there's 5 actually different types of leukocytes or white blood cells. So the leukocytes are going to be the large circular purple ones here. And then you see the little fragments that are also stained purple. Those are going to be the platelets, which again are going to form part of the blood clot as well. So we're going to dive first into the erythrocytes. So the erythrocytes, again, are the red blood cells, and their main function is to carry oxygen to the tissues. And if you remember, what do they have on them? The hemoglobin. So that hemoglobin, the protein, is going to carry those gases, the oxygen, and then deliver the carbon dioxide back. So they differ from the other blood cells, such as the leukocytes, and most other cells, because they are anucleate, which means they don't contain a nucleus. So they actually are not going to have the DNA that allows them to replicate. Red blood cells cannot replicate. Therefore, if you think about it, someone loses blood, they usually need to get a blood transfusion because they don't have the DNA to form, to go through mitosis. So, we're going to learn about the process of red blood cell production. If you remember back to the skeletal system, you think about, okay, where are red blood cells produced? In the bone marrow, that's right. So they're produced in the bone marrow, and that allows for red blood cells to be produced from stem cells. And we'll learn about that process, but a little different, again, that there is no nucleus in the red blood cells. And they contain very, very few organelles. They don't have mitochondria, so they're not producing any ATP. They're actually just kind of like big floating discs covered with hemoglobin. And you can see in this picture here, they're kind of biconcave discs, so that center of the cell, it's not filled with organelles. It's not filled with nucleus. So therefore, it allows for more surface area of the cell, which allows for more hemoglobin. And in general, there's about 5 million red blood cells per cubic millimeter of a sample of blood. So lots and lots of red blood cells. I want you to think and consider to yourself for a second, why is it beneficial if red blood cells don't contain much besides hemoglobin? Why is it beneficial that they don't have the nucleus or the other organelles? Oh, okay, you're probably wondering, okay, well, thinking, I know what hemoglobin does, it carries oxygen. Oh, we need oxygen. Yes. So, red blood cells, the more hemoglobin they have, the more room they have, the more surface area they have for that hemoglobin, the more oxygen they're going to be able to carry. So, that's why it's beneficial. Again, structure facilitates function in this case. And then, two, what are you tested for before you're able to give blood? And why do you think that's important? So if you've ever given blood, they usually will prick your finger and get a little blood out and then put it through a reader. They're testing for iron. Yes, the iron is part of hemoglobin. So hemoglobin is made up of the element iron. So they're trying to see if your body has enough red blood cells / hemoglobin in it. So you're not iron deficient, because if they take blood out of you and you're iron deficient, then you're not going to be able to carry oxygen as well. So that's why it's important that your iron levels are at a good level before they remove blood from your body. Speaking of what happens when there is an imbalance in the red blood cells, specifically with iron. So this is where we have this disorder called anemia, which is a decrease in the oxygen carrying ability of blood. So this can be due to a couple different things. So this can be due to a lower than normal number of red blood cells. So maybe your body isn't producing enough red blood cells. Maybe you've lost a lot of blood. Or it's often caused by just a lack of iron. So how do we get iron? Maybe you've seen it on supplements. Maybe you've seen it on certain foods. We get iron by digesting it, ingesting it, digesting it. And then again, what we eat is what our body may make cells out of. So if we're not eating enough iron, or our body can't absorb enough iron, a lot of times we'll need to take iron supplements. Liver, if you've ever heard of eating liver, has a really good source of iron in it. So a lot of times anemic people, they call people with anemia who are anemic, will have to eat liver in order to get enough iron in their bodies. So sometimes that can be cured with certain diets, but then there's also a genetic anemia called sickle cell anemia, which, way to go, guys, in your flip grids, when I asked the question about this, many of you got what would happen if there was a mutation in the protein for hemoglobin. A lot of you said sickle cell anemia, which, yep, you're exactly right. So a reminder that sickle cell anemia is the mutation in the hemoglobin protein, which causes the hemoglobin to be misshaped and therefore the red blood cell to be misshaped. So you can see that the sickle cell red blood cell here is sickle shaped instead of the round biconcave disc shape of red blood cells, which that again is caused by a mutation in the protein for hemoglobin. And if we look at these red blood cells flowing around in this blood vessel here, we see that there can be a lot of clogging and blocking of blood flow due to the sickle cell, and these aren't going to be able to carry oxygen as well. So people with sickle cell anemia are really going to feel fatigued, they're not going to have enough oxygen, and also blood clots can form too from this. All right, so moving on to the last two formed elements of the blood, we have the white blood cells, also known as the leukocytes, as well as the platelets. So white blood cells, and I know a lot of you talked about this in your coronavirus projects as well, but we know that they're crucial in the body's defense against disease. And what they are is, unlike the red blood cells, these ones are complete with nuclei and organelles. So they look quite a bit different than the red blood cells. And they'll move in and out of blood vessels, which is extremely important because if we have diseased tissue, you want to be able to get those white blood cells to the diseased or inflamed tissue. And how they work is they respond to chemicals that are released by these damaged tissues. So these damaged tissues will kind of release these stress chemicals, and the white blood cells will respond to this, and this is known as positive chemotaxis. And there's actually 5 different types of white blood cells. We're not going to go through those. I'm not going to require that you know those, but they all kind of have different responses. So if you're allergic to something, there's going to be one that responds to that. If there's a disease cell, there's going to be one that's going to eat up and digest that disease cell. They all have different functions there. And lastly, you've heard me mention this word a few times, we have platelets. So platelets are the fragments of cells. You can see there are these little purple guys floating around here. And they're just little portions of cells that are going to be used for the clotting process, which I said before is called hemostasis. And we're going to spend a class period on learning about that process of blood clots in the coming weeks. So that was a lot of information coming at you guys there, but now I know you guys are so excited to get back on Quizlet. So you're going to play some games with Quizlet here, and you're going to, maybe you can find a few people to play some Quizlet Live. I know 2A is going to be so bummed that we're not playing Quizlet Live in class. Sorry, 2A. I know you guys get really excited and competitive with that. But you guys can play match. You can play gravity. Try to beat each other on those different games there to see who can get the quickest time. And then after you're done feeling confident with those terms, you're going to complete your Google Forms quiz. So you're going to need your notes from this presentation, as well as you can get your practice from Quizlet on that in order to complete the quiz. So good luck. And please reach out if you have any questions. I hope you have a great day.